We are very close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, but I still need your support. Please don't forget to take a second and subscribe to my channel. The desert air still carried the heat of the previous day when Natalie Brooks clocked out from her shift at the Desert Palms Inn in Yuma, Arizona, at 3:02 a.m. on July 9, 2010. The night auditor's office smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer toner, the hum of the evaporative coolers echoing through the narrow hallway behind the front desk. Natalie was 26, practical to the point of rigidity, the kind of employee who balanced ledgers twice and left sticky notes for the morning manager reminding him which guests hadn't signed receipts. She'd been working at the Desert Palms for a little over a year, saving money to finish her degree in hospitality management at Arizona Western College. Her co-workers described her as reliable, quiet, friendly when spoken to, but focused on getting through long graveyard shifts that few others wanted. The hotel sat on the edge of town, wedged between a chain restaurant and a half-abandoned strip mall, its beige stucco walls fading under the relentless sun. Guests were mostly truckers, traveling nurses, and construction crews working the new highway expansion. Natalie's last recorded activity that night was running the end-of-day report on the hotel computer, printing receipts, and signing her initials on the nightly cash log. Surveillance footage from the lobby showed her locking the front drawer, switching off the desk lamp, and glancing toward the parking lot before disappearing off camera. What happened between that moment and sunrise would turn a routine night shift into one of Arizona's most haunting cold cases. At 7:45 a.m., the day manager, a 53-year-old former Air Force mechanic named Daniel Ruiz, arrived to find the front doors of the hotel still locked from inside. The lights in the lobby were off, the security chain engaged, and the cash drawer sealed exactly as Natalie would have left it. Her handbag was behind the desk, her car keys hanging on the hook she always used during shifts, her cell phone plugged into its charger with 2 unread text messages from her younger sister. Ruiz assumed she'd fallen asleep in one of the unoccupied rooms, a practice strictly forbidden but not unheard of during slow nights. He checked every floor, every utility closet, every guest room, but Natalie was nowhere. Her Toyota Corolla remained in the far corner of the parking lot, its windshield coated with desert dust, the doors locked. When Ruiz called her cell phone, it vibrated audibly from the charger cradle. He called again, louder this time, then stood in the empty lobby listening to the low mechanical whine of the coolers. The evaporative system, installed decades earlier, was one of the hotel's persistent maintenance issues. A labyrinth of ducts, filters, and reservoirs that moaned when the air was too dry. The sound filled the building like breathing. By 8:30 a.m., Ruiz called 911. Yuma police arrived within 15 minutes, led by Sergeant Alma Contreras, a veteran investigator whose calm efficiency masked her growing concern. Missing employees weren't uncommon. People quit mid-shift, fled debts or relationships, but the sealed building and untouched cash drawer contradicted any voluntary departure. The first walkthrough of the property revealed no signs of struggle, no open exits, no disturbed furniture. The security cameras covered the lobby, back hallway, and parking lot, but the system's feed had stopped recording at 3:14 a.m., exactly 12 minutes after Natalie's last activity log. When technicians reviewed the footage, they found a brief flicker of static at 3:13, then black screen. The feed resumed at 4:42, showing the empty lobby untouched. Investigators initially suspected a power surge or mechanical failure. The hotel's wiring, corroded by decades of dust and heat, was prone to shorting. But the breaker box showed no tripped switches, no irregularities. The time gap wasn't random, it was deliberate. Someone had interrupted the system and restored it manually. The missing 78 minutes became the fulcrum of the entire case. Yuma's crime scene unit treated the Desert Palms like a sealed container. They dusted every surface for prints, vacuumed fibers from carpet edges, and swabbed the front desk for DNA. The results came back sterile. Natalie's fingerprints and DNA where they should be. No unknown profiles, no indication of forced entry or violence. The only anomaly was a faint chemical residue near the service hallway vent, identified later as evaporative cooler fluid mixed with a trace detergent compound not listed among the hotel's maintenance supplies. The discovery seemed trivial at first. The evaporative system leaked constantly, leaving mineral streaks on walls and floors. But the detergent signature suggested someone had recently serviced the equipment using industrial-grade cleanser. The Desert Palms contracted all major maintenance through Yuma Oasis Mechanical Services, a local firm run by a man named Thomas Grady. Grady, 41 at the time, was the hotel's go-to fixer for everything from leaky pipes to failing thermostats. Divorced, soft-spoken, and perpetually tan, he'd been in and out of the property for years, known to staff as Tommy G. He often joked that he knew the building better than its owner. When detectives contacted him on July 9th, he confirmed that he'd performed a coolant flush 2 days prior and hadn't returned since. His maintenance log, handwritten in neat block letters, supported his statement. Grady even provided his signed work order, time-stamped by the front office on July 7th. The report noted no issues with the system and no planned return visit. He sounded genuinely concerned on the phone, offering to assist the investigation in any way he could. "She was a nice girl," he told Sergeant Contreras. "Always had coffee ready when I was working nights." The police, lacking evidence of foul play, listed Natalie as a missing person. They canvassed surrounding businesses, reviewed highway cameras, and interviewed truck drivers who'd checked out that morning. None reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. The only witness who mentioned Natalie after 3 a.m. was a guest in room 214, a traveling salesman from Phoenix, who told police he'd heard metal scraping in the ventilation shafts around 3:30, but assumed it was maintenance. When Contreras followed up with maintenance staff, they insisted no work had been scheduled overnight. The salesman's statement was noted but not prioritized. Days passed. Temperatures climbed above 110 degrees. Flyers bearing Natalie's smiling face curled and yellowed on telephone poles. Her family drove in from Flagstaff, organizing search teams that combed dry washes and culverts along Interstate 8. Detectives followed dead-end leads, a sighting at a Circle K, a rumor she'd run off with a married guest, but nothing connected. Then, 3 weeks into the investigation, a housekeeping supervisor discovered something strange. During routine filter replacement on the roof, she found a keycard wedged in the evaporative cooler intake vent, its surface warped by heat and moisture. The card was printed with the Desert Palms logo but lacked a magnetic strip. It wasn't an issued room key, it was a counterfeit. Forensic analysis revealed that the card's plastic composition didn't match the manufacturer's standard blanks. It had been 3D printed, the embedded chip manually programmed to bypass the hotel's electronic locks. Someone with access to the property's system and technical knowledge had created it. When police cross-referenced the card's circuitry, they found that it duplicated a staff master key code used only by maintenance and management. Ruiz, the manager, had his MasterCard secured in the locked office safe. Maintenance staff had access to one additional MasterCard, stored at Yuma Oasis Mechanical. Grady signed that card out personally on July 8th, the day before Natalie disappeared, and never returned it. When confronted, he claimed he'd misplaced it during a late-night service call at another client's facility. His tone remained calm, his demeanor helpful, but his story contained subtle inconsistencies. Phone records placed him within a 2-mile radius of the Desert Palms at 3 a.m., contradicting his claim that he'd been at a cold storage warehouse on the opposite side of town. He explained the discrepancy as a GPS glitch, common in desert regions. Contreras wasn't convinced. A search warrant executed on Grady's work truck revealed standard tools, lubricant cans, and repair forms, but also 2 unopened bottles of industrial-grade detergent identical to the residue found near the vent. When questioned, Grady said he'd picked them up for future jobs. The case teetered between suspicion and speculation. Without a body, a crime scene, or conclusive forensic evidence, the county attorney refused to authorize an arrest. Natalie Brooks became another face on the Arizona Department of Public Safety's missing persons website. Her family search persisted for years, gradually shrinking from public campaigns to private rituals. Her mother, Ellen Brooks, visited Yuma every July, leaving a bouquet at the hotel fence. The Desert Palms changed ownership in 2015, rebranded as a budget chain, but staff whispered about the night auditor who'd vanished from a locked building. Maintenance logs still bore Grady's handwriting. He remained employed with Yuma Oasis, aging into local obscurity, a quiet man who fixed things and kept to himself. It would take nearly a decade, and one chance discovery during a monsoon renovation, to expose what had really happened inside the hotel that night, and the double life of the man everyone trusted to keep the air running in the desert heat. The storm that would finally expose the truth began on the evening of August 19, 2019, when monsoon rains hammered Yuma for the first time in years. Sheets of water cascaded down the stucco walls of the Desert Palms, now renamed the Sunrise Lodge, turning the parking lot into a shallow river that reflected the flickering neon sign. Inside, the building was under partial renovation, its third major overhaul since 2010. Contractors were replacing the obsolete evaporative cooling system with modern HVAC units. The old roof vents, crusted with lime and dust, were being dismantled section by section. At 6:42 p.m., a maintenance worker named Carlos Navarro climbed onto the roof to remove the final duct housing above the old east wing. The rain had slackened to a drizzle, and he was eager to finish before lightning returned. As he loosened the last rusted bolts, his wrench slipped into the vent. When he leaned down to retrieve it, his flashlight beam caught something wedged deep inside the shaft. A flash of red fabric, shrunken and discolored by years of heat. At first he thought it was insulation. When he tugged, the material resisted, stiff and heavy. He called for his foreman. Together they pried open the vent casing and found what they thought was a mannequin wrapped in desiccated cloth. Within minutes, the foreman realized it wasn't synthetic material at all. Police sealed the property within the hour. The human remains, mummified by a decade of arid airflow, were transported to the Yuma County Medical Examiner's office. The red fabric turned out to be a uniform blouse from the Desert Palms, navy piping, faded name tag reading Natalie. Her body had been compressed into the lower duct compartment, concealed behind a removable panel accessible only from the service crawl space above the laundry room. The panel's screws bore traces of a chemical compound, identical to the industrial detergent found in 2010. Detectives reopened the case within 12 hours. The file had sat dormant for 9 years, its evidence boxes sealed and gathering dust in the county storage annex. Sergeant Alma Contreras had retired in 2016, but she returned as a consultant when the discovery hit the news. The new lead investigator, Detective Luis Ortega, was 38, methodical, and quiet. He'd grown up in Yuma, remembered the disappearance as local lore, a ghost story parents told their teenagers about staying out too late. Now he was staring at a skeleton that made the legend real. The autopsy revealed that Natalie Brooks had suffered a blunt force trauma to the left side of her skull, consistent with a fall against metal piping. There were no defensive wounds, no fractures elsewhere. The coroner could not determine whether the injury was accidental or inflicted. The state of the remains made toxicology impossible. But forensic analysts recovered trace residues from her hair and clothing, compounds consistent with evaporative cooler solution mixed with surfactant cleaner. The same chemical signature, the same detergent pattern. The discovery reignited public interest overnight. Local media called it the Desert Palms mystery reopened. For Yuma residents, it was both shocking and familiar, another secret exposed by the desert years after everyone had stopped looking. Within a week, Detective Ortega re-interviewed everyone associated with the hotel in 2010. Daniel Ruiz, now living in Tucson, repeated the same account he'd given 9 years earlier. Housekeeping staff described the locked doors, the silent hallways, the way the air had smelled faintly of bleach that morning. Most had moved on, reluctant to revisit the memory. But one name kept resurfacing in their recollections, Tommy G., the maintenance man who was always around, even when he wasn't supposed to be. Ortega found Thomas Grady still in Yuma, still employed by Yuma Oasis Mechanical, now as senior maintenance supervisor. He owned a small house on Avenue C, where he lived alone with 2 aging dogs. His personnel file showed no criminal history, no disciplinary actions. He was 60 now, heavier, slower, his hair bleached gray by sun and dust. When Ortega arrived unannounced one Tuesday morning, Grady opened the door in a faded company polo and khaki shorts. His living room smelled faintly of solvent and dog shampoo. The detective introduced himself, mentioned the reopened case, and asked if Grady would answer a few questions. Grady hesitated only a second before inviting him inside. His voice remained calm, the same careful cadence that colleagues once described as polite to a fault. "You finally found her, huh?" he said, half sighing, half smiling. Ortega noted the phrasing. "You finally found her, not they." For nearly 2 hours, the detective walked Grady through the original investigation. His last service call, the counterfeit keycard, the detergent residue. Grady listened without interruption, occasionally rubbing the back of his neck as if massaging an old ache. When Ortega mentioned the evaporative cooler duct where Natalie's body had been found, Grady's eyes flicked toward the window, tracking something invisible beyond the glass. That old system was a death trap, he muttered. Should have been replaced years before. Ortega pressed further. He asked how long it would take a skilled maintenance worker to access the lower vent compartment, the one hidden above the laundry room. Grady shrugged. Depends who did it. Someone who knows the layout could do it in 20 minutes. Someone like you? Ortega asked. Grady looked at him for a long moment. Someone like me, he said quietly. The interview ended without incident, but Ortega left with the sense that Grady was holding something back, an awareness of details he shouldn't have known. The detective's instincts, honed by years of interrogations, told him that Grady's calm wasn't innocence. It was control. Over the next month, Ortega built a mosaic of circumstantial evidence. Maintenance logs showed that Grady had checked out the same master key card on July 8, 2010, and returned it on July 10th, one day after Natalie disappeared. The log's signature, when analyzed by handwriting experts, displayed inconsistencies suggesting it had been written after the fact. Surveillance from the Oasis Mechanical Warehouse dated July 9th showed Grady arriving at 6:12 a.m., later than he'd claimed. His work truck's mileage record for that day included an unexplained 4.3-mile discrepancy. That distance, plotted on a map, corresponded roughly to the round trip between his home and the Desert Palms. Most damning was a discovery made by state forensic technicians revisiting the 2010 evidence. The counterfeit keycard found in the vent still held microscopic residue in its seams. When subjected to modern DNA amplification, the sample yielded a partial male profile, 13 alleles matching Thomas Grady's. It was the first physical connection between him and the crime scene. Ortega obtained a warrant for Grady's DNA. The sample confirmed the match. The county attorney's office finally had enough to reclassify Natalie Brooks's death as a homicide. Still, Ortega wanted a confession. He arranged a second interview at the police station on September 14th. Grady arrived voluntarily, wearing a pressed shirt, his demeanor unchanged. The detective began by showing him the crime scene photos, the duct panel, the uniform blouse, the deteriorated name tag. Grady studied them with an expression that hovered between sorrow and fascination. When Ortega mentioned the DNA evidence, the older man exhaled through his nose, eyes fixed on the table. I always knew she'd be found, he said. Desert doesn't keep secrets forever. Then he began to talk, not in a rush of guilt, but in slow, deliberate sentences, like a man recounting a technical failure he'd spent years analyzing. He told Ortega that Natalie had caught him accessing the maintenance control panel behind the front desk around 3 a.m. She'd asked what he was doing, and he'd panicked. He claimed he'd been using the master key card to test door locks as part of an after-hours inspection, a lie she immediately challenged. She threatened to call the manager. According to Grady, he'd grabbed her arm to stop her from dialing, and she'd slipped, striking her head on the metal edge of the counter. It wasn't supposed to happen, he said. I just didn't want to lose the contract. In the chaos that followed, he'd dragged her body to the service corridor, convinced she was dead. Fear of losing his job and going to prison drove him to conceal the evidence. He'd chosen the vent because he knew it would remain untouched for years. The airflow would dry everything, he said flatly. No smell, no insects. The perfect tomb. Ortega asked why the camera feed had gone dark. Grady admitted to pulling the fuse from the recording unit and restoring it once he'd finished hiding her. When the detective pressed about the counterfeit keycard, Grady smiled faintly. I made that one myself, he said. It was easier than begging the office for spares. The confession, recorded and signed, ended a decade of speculation. Grady waived his right to counsel until formal charges were filed. 2 days later, the Yuma County attorney announced his arrest for second-degree murder, evidence tampering, and abuse of a corpse. News spread through town like wildfire. Television crews parked outside the Sunrise Lodge. Former guests called in to share memories of strange noises, odd drafts, unexplained maintenance visits. The once-forgotten case became a national headline. Hotel worker admits to hiding night auditor's body in vent for 9 years. At the press conference, Detective Ortega stood beside Sergeant Contreras, now gray-haired but still sharp-eyed. She told reporters, This case reminds us that the truth waits. Sometimes the desert itself delivers it back to us. Grady's arraignment drew crowds that overflowed the courthouse steps. He appeared subdued, his expression unreadable as prosecutors outlined the evidence. The Brooks family sat in the front row. Natalie's mother clutched a photo of her daughter, lips pressed white. When Grady was escorted past, she whispered, "Why?" But he didn't look at her. The trial would take another year, winding through procedural delays and defense arguments about intent. But for Yuma, the arrest was enough. The ghost of the desert palms had a name, and the man who'd kept the air cool for a decade would spend the rest of his life behind walls that no maintenance key could unlock. The courthouse in downtown Yuma had never seen so many cameras. Reporters crowded under the awning to escape the August heat as the state of Arizona versus Thomas Grady opened on August 10, 2020. Inside, the cool air carried the faint scent of cleaning solvent and paper, the same sterile odor that had permeated the desert palms all those years ago. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Helen Monroe, was calm but relentless. She began her opening statement not with evidence, but with sound, playing the faint hum of evaporative fans recorded during the crime scene reconstruction. "This," she told the jury, "is what Natalie Brooks heard in her final minutes. A machine meant to cool the desert, masking the sound of a life ending." The courtroom was silent except for the mechanical drone. Jurors leaned forward. Across the room, Thomas Grady sat between his attorneys, staring at the table, hands folded, eyes half-lidded. He looked less like a monster and more like what he had always been. Ordinary, forgettable, a man who had spent decades blending into the background hum of maintenance schedules and air filters. That ordinariness was the prosecution's weapon. Monroe painted Grady as a man whose invisibility made him dangerous, a fixer who knew every locked door, every duct, every blind spot in the surveillance system. He didn't just know how to hide evidence. He knew how to hide himself. She walked the jury through his quiet obsession with control, service logs rewritten in perfect block letters, duplicate key cards created for efficiency, equipment inspected at odd hours without notice. Each detail, she argued, showed a man who believed rules applied to everyone except him. The defense countered with a different narrative. Grady's lead attorney, Craig Dunn, portrayed his client as an overworked tradesman caught in a tragic accident. He emphasized the lack of intent, the absence of prior violence, and the confession's tone, remorseful, not calculating. He panicked, Dunn told the jury. He made a terrible choice. But panic is not murder. For weeks, the courtroom oscillated between clinical evidence and human grief. The prosecution reconstructed the timeline minute by minute. Natalie finishing her audit at 3:02 a.m. Grady entering through the maintenance door at 3:07, the camera blackout at 3:13, and the silence that followed. Forensic technicians demonstrated how the counterfeit keycard had been fabricated using software downloaded from an open-source security forum. The melted plastic, the imperfect chip soldering, the trace DNA, each detail tightened the noose around Grady's claim of accident. The state's forensic pathologist testified that the skull fracture could have resulted from a single blow delivered with significant force, not a fall. But the 10 years of desiccation complicated certainty. The jury heard how desert heat could preserve secrets, how chemical residues told stories when flesh could not. During cross-examination, Dunn challenged every assumption. He asked whether panic could produce the kind of precision required to hide a body in a vent and reseal the panel flawlessly. Monroe countered that Grady's entire life had been training for exactly that kind of concealment.
"He spent decades learning to make things disappear," she said, pointing to the defendant.
Leaks, noises, evidence. The most haunting testimony came from Sergeant Alma Contreras. Her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had waited too long for answers. She described the original investigation, the locked lobby, the silence of the coolers. When Monroe asked what she remembered most from that night, Contreras said, "The smell. The air was too clean. Someone had scrubbed fear out of the room." Her words hit the jury harder than any diagram or photograph. The courtroom shifted, a murmur passing through reporters' rows. Natalie's mother, Ellen Brooks, sat rigid, fingers intertwined around her daughter's photo. When the prosecution rested, the defense called Grady himself to the stand. It was a calculated risk. He spoke softly, addressing the jury as if explaining a repair job gone wrong. "I was fixing things that night," he began. "The system kept shorting, and I wanted to finish before the storm season." His version remained unchanged, an accidental fall, a split-second decision to hide the evidence out of fear. But his calm precision worked against him. When asked to demonstrate how he'd lifted Natalie's body into the duct, he described the process with mechanical detail, weight distribution, leverage, the type of screwdriver needed. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances. It sounded less like remorse and more like procedure. Monroe seized the moment. "Mr. Grady," she said, "you hid her for 9 years. During that time, you worked under those same vents. You heard the same sound every night. Did it ever occur to you that she was still there, inches above your head?" Grady hesitated. "I tried not to think about it," he said. The prosecutor let the silence stretch. "That," she said finally, "is the definition of guilt." The defense attempted to humanize him in closing arguments, reminding jurors that fear can turn ordinary people into criminals. But the jury had spent 3 weeks immersed in the hum of machinery and the claustrophobia of ducts and vents. On September 3, 2220, after 9 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing 3 weeks later drew another crowd. Judge Karen Halstead, stern and precise, reviewed the case history in measured tones. "The desert keeps many things," she said, "but truth, like heat, eventually rises." She sentenced Thomas Grady to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. As deputies led him away, he turned once toward Ellen Brooks. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She didn't respond. Outside, the press dubbed him the duct killer. True crime forums dissected every detail: the counterfeit keycard, the missing fuse, the detergent residue, as if reconstructing a blueprint for guilt. Podcasts replayed Monroe's opening statement, calling it one of the most chilling in modern courtroom history. Yet for Yuma residents, the trial's end didn't bring closure. The Desert Palms, now the Sunrise Lodge, stood empty again. The new owners canceled renovation plans, citing unforeseen circumstances. Locals swore they could still hear the low hum of air moving through ducts on windless nights. Some said it sounded like a woman breathing. For Detective Ortega, the aftermath was quieter but heavier. His office filled with commendations, newspaper clippings, and a letter from Ellen Brooks thanking him for listening when the evidence was just dust. Yet he couldn't shake one thought. Grady's confession accounted for everything except one detail. The additional residue found on the vent screws contained traces of a second chemical not matching the detergent, an epoxy used in industrial sealing, manufactured exclusively for a facility in Gila Bend. That facility had only one known maintenance contractor in 2010, Yuma Oasis Mechanical. Ortega filed the information away, uncertain whether it meant anything more than coincidence. But at night, when he replayed the recordings, he heard something in Grady's voice, a calm too deliberate, a phrasing too practiced. It was as if he'd rehearsed not the confession, but the act of surrender. In a follow-up interview from the state prison 6 months later, Grady told Ortega, "You think it's over because you put me in a box, but you're just the next one maintaining the system." The words lingered long after Ortega left. The detective didn't understand them fully until 2 years later, when another maintenance worker at a motel 90 miles north of Yuma vanished under similar circumstances. Her car untouched, her shift records intact, the evaporative coolers still humming. The disappearance in Parker, Arizona, 2 years after Grady's conviction, reignited the unease that Yuma had tried to bury. On June 12, 2022, 31-year-old hotel clerk Melissa Duran failed to clock out from her shift at the Riverbend Inn, a low-rise motel along Highway 95 that catered mostly to truckers and tourists heading toward Lake Havasu. Her manager found the front desk empty at 4:30 a.m., the cash drawer untouched, her phone charging behind the counter, and the doors still locked from inside. Surveillance footage cut out at 3:11 a.m. for exactly 70 minutes before resuming to an empty lobby. The similarities were undeniable. Within 48 hours, Yuma County investigators were on site assisting local law enforcement. Detective Luis Ortega arrived wearing the same gray suit he'd worn at Grady's sentencing, though it now hung looser on his shoulders. He walked through the lobby with a flashlight, tracing his beam across ceiling vents and security panels. The same faint hum greeted him, the whisper of evaporative cooling units cycling air through narrow ducts. The building had been serviced by Desert Air Systems, a small contractor recently acquired by none other than Yuma Oasis Mechanical. Thomas Grady might have been behind bars, but the company bearing his signature processes still maintained hotels across western Arizona. Ortega's chest tightened. When technicians opened the maintenance records, they found an invoice dated June 10th, marked routine filter replacement. The service technician's name leapt off the page, T. Grady, Jr. Ortega had never heard of a son. A background search revealed that Thomas Grady had fathered a child from a brief marriage in the mid-1980s, a boy named Tyler, who'd left Yuma at 18 and worked sporadically as an HVAC installer. There were no criminal records, no social media, almost no trace of adult life until a contractor's license appeared in 2017 for a technician operating out of Blythe, California. The photo on file showed a lean man with his father's pale eyes and the same faint smirk. Ortega felt a cold pulse of recognition. When he visited the Riverbend Inn's rooftop later that afternoon, he saw fresh tool marks around the main vent panel and faint streaks of white sealant that glistened in the sunlight. The same epoxy formula identified years earlier in Yuma. He crouched beside the opening and inhaled. The air was thick with detergent and rust. He knew before the test confirmed it that the residue matched the compound found on Natalie Brooks's vent screws. Forensics teams combed the property for days, draining the cooler tanks and dissecting every duct. They found no body, no clothing, no conclusive evidence of Melissa Duran's fate. But the methodical pattern, the sealed system, the blackout period, the untouched cache, echoed like ritual. When Ortega reported his findings to the State Bureau, officials hesitated. The agency's press division worried that connecting a new disappearance to a convicted killer's name might reignite panic. The official line called it an isolated missing person case. But Ortega couldn't let it go. He drove to the state prison in Florence and requested an interview with Thomas Grady, now 62 and serving life. The man who once obsessed over maintenance logs had aged into a ghost of himself, skin ashen, eyes watery from years under fluorescent lights. They sat in a narrow visitation booth separated by glass. Grady smiled when he saw the detective. "Back for more repairs?" he asked. Ortega slid a file folder across the counter, even though the glass prevented contact. "Riverbend Inn?" he said. Another clerk gone. Same pattern, same signature. Grady's expression didn't change, but his breathing slowed. "You think I could do that from in here?" "No," Ortega said. "But someone could be following your blueprint." For a long time, Grady stared at the file's cover. "You think the system ends with me?" he said softly. "But you never fixed the leak. Who's Tyler?" Ortega asked. The older man's lips curled slightly. "The only thing I ever built that still works." He refused to say more. The interview ended abruptly when guards escorted him back to his cell. The following week, Ortega contacted California authorities to locate Tyler Grady. The address on his contractor's license led to a rented storage unit near Blythe. Inside, officers found shelves stacked with maintenance manuals, lock bypass kits, and dozens of counterfeit key cards labeled by hotel name. In a rusted toolbox, they discovered a printed circuit encoder identical to the one Thomas had used years earlier, along with epoxy containers bearing matching lot numbers to the Riverbend Inn residue. But Tyler himself was gone. A neighbor reported seeing his white pickup leave 2 nights earlier, heading east toward Phoenix. The truck was found abandoned near Quartzsite 3 days later, the ignition hot-wired, driver's seat stained with a mix of coolant and detergent. The passenger side window bore faint fingerprints, too smudged for identification. Investigators expanded the search statewide. Anonymous tips flooded in, sightings at truck stops, diners, rest areas, but none confirmed. For the first time, Ortega felt the edge of obsession that had consumed his predecessors. Every motel vent, every faint hum of air became a potential tomb. He drove hundreds of miles across the desert, inspecting rooftop units and service logs, haunted by the echo of Thomas Grady's words, "You never fixed the leak." Then, in late August, a maintenance worker at a decommissioned rest stop near Gila Bend reported a strange smell coming from the abandoned staff quarters. When deputies pried open the vent above the break room, they found fragments of human tissue wrapped in degraded uniform fabric, navy piping, faint stains. Partial name tag, M. Duran. DNA confirmed Melissa's identity within 48 hours. The cooler housing contained residues of the same detergent epoxy mixture. Embedded in the dust at the base of the vent was a broken counterfeit key card bearing the logo of the Riverbend Inn. It was printed on the same non-standard plastic blend used by Thomas Grady's forgeries. Tyler Grady's fingerprints were found on the card's edges. The state police issued a warrant for his arrest, but he had already vanished into the maze of interstate truck stops and repair shops stretching across Arizona's southern corridor. Forensic analysts traced his purchases through supply vendors, industrial sealant, coolant additives, plastic key blanks, each bought under fake company names. It was as if he were continuing his father's work, methodically refining it. True crime outlets called him the airway ghost. For Ortega, the case blurred the line between legacy and contagion. He began compiling every unexplained disappearance involving service workers in the past decade, looking for patterns of ductwork, cooling systems, and electrical outages. The list grew alarmingly long. His superiors urged caution, warning against fueling hysteria. But Ortega saw in the data a chilling continuity. The Grady method wasn't just murder. It was engineering, a system of concealment passed down like trade knowledge. Meanwhile, back in Florence prison, Thomas Grady suffered a stroke. Before losing consciousness, he reportedly told a guard, "The air's still moving." He died 3 days later without regaining speech. His funeral drew no family except a single anonymous attendee who stood apart from the small crowd of state officials. Security cameras later identified the man by facial recognition as Tyler Grady. He disappeared before officers could detain him. The footage showed him lingering near the grave as dusk fell, one hand pressed against the casket as if testing for airflow. The desert wind rose, carrying dust across the yard, blurring the image until his outline dissolved into the horizon. By autumn of 2022, the legend of the Grady family had begun to twist itself into something larger than the facts. Television crews described a father and son bound by machinery, murder, and silence, while online forums speculated about a hidden network of maintenance workers trading blueprints for the perfect disappearance. Detective Luis Ortega, hollow-eyed from months on the road, refused to indulge conspiracy, but couldn't ignore the pattern unfolding across the desert. He sat in his office late one night surrounded by case files, maps peppered with pins, maintenance logs retrieved from motels in Blythe, Quartzsite, and Maricopa. The air conditioner buzzed overhead, rhythmic and steady, until he realized the sound was perfectly synchronized with his heartbeat. Every duct, every vent, every hum of machinery had become the echo of a ghost he couldn't bury. The Bureau's analysis confirmed what he feared. 3 additional disappearances over the past decade shared identical details: locked lobbies, counterfeit keycards, evaporative systems tampered with, surveillance gaps lasting precisely between 60 and 80 minutes. All properties had been serviced at least once by companies under the Yuma Oasis mechanical umbrella. Tyler Grady wasn't improvising. He was reproducing a system perfected by his father and quietly dispersed through every corporate acquisition. Each technician inherited procedures without realizing their origin, codes embedded in training manuals, checklists, and circuit templates. The system itself had learned how to persist. Ortega's next break came in November, when a motel in Casa Grande reported a break-in at its maintenance bay. The intruder had stolen only electronic components, card encoders, wiring schematics, and a single case of industrial detergent. Surveillance captured a man in a ball cap and respirator mask, working with methodical precision. When analysts enhanced the footage, the eyes were unmistakable, pale gray, steady, deliberate. Tyler Grady was alive, moving east. Ortega alerted every station along the I-10 corridor, but no one saw him. It was as if he traveled inside the infrastructure itself, invisible to everyone except those who heard the silence that followed his passing. The detective's obsession deepened into insomnia. He replayed interviews with Thomas Grady, searching for code. In one recording, the old man had tapped his fingers against the table in a rhythm Ortega dismissed as nervous habit. Listening again, he realized the sequence matched the timing pattern for a standard HVAC service override: 5 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, 2. The gesture wasn't nervousness. It was instruction. He contacted a retired engineer who'd worked with Yuma Oasis before its rebranding. The man confirmed that certain legacy systems could be bypassed using rhythmic power cycles, a crude but effective way to cut electricity without triggering alarms. Exactly what had happened at the Desert Palms and the Riverbend Inn. If someone knew the cadence, the engineer said, they could silence the whole building for an hour without leaving a trace. Ortega drove to every site tied to the Gradys, tapping out the sequence on control panels, watching the lights flicker and die, hearing the hum cease as if the air itself were holding its breath. He felt like he was summoning something. In December, a tip came from a rest stop clerk outside Eloy who claimed a man matching Tyler's description had bought coolant and 2 gallons of distilled water, paying in cash, driving a white van with no plates. The clerk remembered him because he'd asked a strange question. You ever think about what happens to air when nobody's breathing it? The next morning, security staff at a storage facility in Tucson found one of their evaporative units running nonstop, even though the system was disabled for winter. When they opened the casing, they discovered tools, chemical containers, and a small USB drive sealed in plastic. The drive contained schematics, labeled Cycle Protocol v3.0. The files detailed modifications to standard cooling ducts that created hidden compartments large enough to conceal a human body without disrupting airflow. The metadata bore a creation date of 2019 and an author tag, T. Grady. Forensics confirmed the fingerprint on the plastic belonged to Tyler. It was the first concrete trace in months. Ortega stared at the diagrams, marveling at the precision. Tyler had taken his father's crude concealment and optimized it into an engineering problem, calculating air pressure, temperature loss, and sound masking to ensure no odor or vibration betrayed what was inside. It was murder-turned-mechanical art. When Ortega presented the findings to the Bureau, his superiors hesitated again, citing lack of public safety benefit in revealing unconfirmed suspects. The detective ignored them. He began assembling a task force of local officers and forensic specialists who believed the same thing he did, that the Grady's crimes weren't isolated acts of violence but the manifestation of an ideology, control through infrastructure, mastery over the unseen. Every vent, every machine, every hum of air was part of the same design. In early January 2023, the task force received word of a missing subcontractor from a motel in Gila Bend, the same rest stop district where Melissa Duran had been found. The worker's name was Arturo Medina, 39, last seen entering the roof access hatch to inspect cooling ducts. He never came down. When police arrived, the hatch was closed from inside, padlock intact. The air inside the ducts still moved steadily, temperature perfectly regulated. They dismantled the system section by section until they reached the main intake chamber. Inside lay Medina's body, curled and dry, skin bleached to parchment. His tools were arranged beside him as if displayed for inspection. On his glove, scrawled in faded blue ink, was a message, "Air remembers." Forensic analysis linked epoxy and detergent compounds identical to the previous scenes, along with latent prints from Tyler Grady. But something new appeared this time. Traces of a polymer adhesive not used in any commercial product. Lab technicians determined it was a prototype sealant. Formulation incomplete, experimental. The formula's signature indicated a mixture of standard epoxy and an additive derived from blood plasma. Ortega felt the bottom drop from his stomach. The killer had begun using biological material as part of his mixture, perhaps to test durability, perhaps to mark his work. The case now stretched beyond homicide into something obsessive, almost artistic. He realized Tyler wasn't hiding victims. He was embedding them into the airflow, making them part of the mechanism. The hum that haunted every scene wasn't coincidence. It was resonance, the system breathing through the dead. Ortega began having nightmares of ducts filled with bones, of hotel walls exhaling whispers. He returned to the desert palm site one last time, now fully abandoned, boarded up and baking under the desert sun. Inside, the air was still, yet faintly he could hear the same old hum, distant and uneven. He followed it to the service corridor where Natalie Brooks had vanished 13 years earlier. The vent there had been sealed after the investigation, but now the screws were missing. When he pried it open, a warm draft hit his face, carrying the scent of detergent and rust. On the inner panel, etched faintly into the metal with a screwdriver tip, were 4 words. "The cycle continues here." He stood frozen, flashlight trembling. Somewhere deep in the ductwork, air moved again, deliberate and rhythmic, like a heartbeat echoing through metal. The weeks after Ortega found the etched message inside the abandoned desert palms, settled into a brittle calm that felt like the pause between electrical cycles, a silence that carried intention, and he used it to build the one thing the Gradys had never expected from law enforcement. A system to answer a system, a protocol to meet a protocol, He called it the resonance net, and it began with sound rather than sight, because cameras had always failed him at the crucial moment while the airflow never lied. So he met with a university acoustics lab in Tempe and asked whether a building's ductwork could be tuned the way a technician tunes an engine, whether minute changes in pressure and velocity could be captured and mapped across time, and the answer, delivered in careful equations and skeptical smiles, was yes. If they could seed the network with contact mics and measure the harmonic signature of normal operation long enough to recognize an intrusion as a discordant note in the score. And so over the next month, Ortega's task force installed palm-sized sensors in the vents of a dozen high-risk properties along the I-8 and I-10 corridors, budget inns, rest stops, 2 aging motels slated for renovation, devices hidden behind return grills and junction boxes, piggybacking on the maintenance Wi-Fi because the men they hunted trusted that network more than any other. And in parallel, he subpoenaed purchase orders from chemical vendors statewide, cross-referencing epoxy additives against the boutique formulation the lab had linked to Tyler's experiments, then narrowed it further by lot number until 3 small shipments stood out, all cash, all picked up at end of day by the same throwaway LLC that shared a P.O. box with a used tool reseller outside Buckeye. And on the last Friday of February, the clerk remembered the buyer because he'd asked if the cartons could be double-taped to keep the dust out. Pale eyes above a faded ball cap, a voice that turned friendliness into compliance. And when Ortega pulled the surveillance from a neighboring unit, he watched a white van back into the alley with its plates masked by blue painter's tape, then reverse out with a care that read as ritual, and he knew the cycle was still turning toward them, the alert. When it finally came was nothing dramatic. Just a variation in the hum at a weathered motel outside Dateland where the highway drops into a long, flat mirage of asphalt. The algorithm flagged a fast on-off cadence on the breaker feeding the security recorder. 5 pulses, pause, 3 pulses, pause, 2. The old rhythm Thomas had tapped on a table, followed by a pressure dip in the east wing intake suggesting a panel had been opened and a secondary airflow path created. And Ortega was already in the car when the call reached him. Tires burning toward a building that looked like any other desert hosteler's last choice, stucco blistered, paint chalky beneath a sky the color of hot ash. And as he pulled in, he killed his siren and parked across the street behind an RV whose owner was asleep with a paperback on his chest. Then walked the perimeter alone as his team staged 2 blocks out, and the ducts above the laundry room thrummed with an uneven tone. His ear now recognized the way a musician recognizes a wrong note, a living instrument taught to lie, and a thin line of sealant shone fresh along a panel seam, sun not yet dulling its sheen, while through the lobby glass he saw the night clerk on the phone, eyes wide, whispering that the cameras had blinked twice and then gone dark. And as the detective reached the roof access hatch, he found a new lock, a cheap replacement set in a scarware. The old hardware had been drilled out, yet someone had misjudged the weathered metal and the screws bit shallow. So when he pressed, he felt the panel flex, a body's weight against a diaphragm. A breath held and now forced to release, and he eased it open into a corridor of heat and dust where the hum was nearer. More intimate, like air moving across teeth, he found the first tool 10 feet in. A small T-handle driver dropped in haste and dusted with grains of white polymer from a machined card blank. And next, a coiled length of tape marked with codes for breaker sequences. And finally, the counterfeit master key card itself, still warm to the touch, as if recently handled. The logo for the motel's parent chain printed with slight bleed at the edges, the chip imperfectly seated beneath the lamination, the telltale imperfection of a home encoder, and beyond the elbow turn a silhouette crouched at the junction box, a man in a respirator mask and a cap turned backward, forearms roped and steady, breath slow in the metronome rhythm of someone whose body had learned to move with machines, and Ortega did not call out his name. He did not risk a flight into ducts he could not navigate without causing the collapse of evidence and maybe of someone still alive. Instead, he leaned into the opening and spoke not to the man, but to the metal. To the system itself. He said, "We tuned your song, Tyler. The building is loud with your fingerprints," and the figure kept working for a heartbeat longer, perhaps believing in the old advantage of invisibility, the old apprenticeship of being the quietest man in the room. Then his head tilted the smallest degree and he turned, eyes pale and unsurprised, because what else could happen when the cycle had been designed to return to its source? And in that moment 2 officers came up through the south hatch and another through the north. Soft shoes on hot roof, and Tyler pivoted as if to rabbit down the shaft. But he saw the clamps Ortega had already placed. Across the panel seam, small aluminum stops that would jam the cover if forced, and he paused just long enough for the detective to put his open hands into view and say, "There is nothing to fix here, except what broke a long time ago." And the younger Grady exhaled through his mask, a tired sound, and set the driver down before raising both palms, the most ordinary surrender in an unremarkable place, the end of a method that had thrived, precisely because it seemed like nothing worth noticing. They brought him down the exterior service stairs in the blue hour before dawn as semis rolled east like slow asteroids, and the motel's vacancy sign blinked itself toward morning. And in the interview room 8 hours later, he sat in a clean shirt provided by the jailer, hands folded with the same mechanic's neatness his father had displayed in court. And he listened to Ortega read the warrant and the list of counts. And when asked for counsel, he said not yet, as if saving a last tool for a final job. Then he talked, not in theatrics, but in small, accurate pieces. A parts diagram turned into sentences, how he had learned by watching without being taught, how his father's notes were not confessions, but protocols for taking up space without being seen, how you could live between the hum and the silence if you understood that people always trusted the air because it asked nothing in return. And he denied killing Melissa Duran until Ortega placed the photograph of the rest stop vent on the table, the broken keycard haloed in dust, the epoxy bead scalloped by fingerprints that matched his, and then he closed his eyes and said the word accident in a voice that contained no belief. And when they pressed for other names, he gave none. Not because there were conspirators, but because the whole point of the system had always been that it required no one else. It replicated itself through manuals and habits and the laziness of institutions that outsourced their attention to the hum of machinery. And the statement ran for 3 hours on tape with long pauses, where his breath seemed to calibrate itself to the air conditioner's fan. And at the end he asked one question of Ortega. "Did you really hear it?" And Ortega said yes. The building told on you. The trial began the following spring in a courtroom scrubbed so clean that the echo of footsteps sounded like a metronome. And the prosecution chose a frame that would resist romance. Not a son finishing a father's dark symphony, but a series of deliberate acts placed end to end to create a result he understood and chose. They presented the resonance net data as a visual staff where the blackout cadence appeared as staccato bars, the pressure dips as sustained tones, and they asked jurors to hear the crime the way you might hear a familiar engine misfire. You don't need to see the spark plug to know it is wrong. And they layered that with the chemical trail, the boutique epoxy, the detergent profile, the experimental polymer signature from Arturo Medina's duct, the receipts and the footage from the tool reseller, the encoder found in the Blythe unit, the USB drive with cycle protocol v3.0, and finally the old prints from the counterfeit keycard recovered at the Desert Palms years earlier, a ghost reaching forward to touch the living hand that had continued the work. And when the defense tried accident the way Dunn had with Thomas, the state answered with design, showing how the preventive clamps on the Dateland panel would have trapped anyone he placed inside, how the timed blackouts were not panicked improvisations, but rehearsed steps engraved into his body like muscle memory. In the end, the verdict arrived with the inevitability of heat rising from a road. Guilty on all counts tied to Melissa Duran and Arturo Medina, and tampering at multiple scenes. And although the court could not retry the dead father through the living son, the judge spoke of cycles and responsibility and how inheritance is not absolution, and she sentenced Tyler Grady to life without parole, a silence larger than any duct. And when reporters asked Ortega whether this solved the Arizona 2010 case, he said yes and also no. Because the truth had been solved in 2019 when Natalie's body was found and Thomas confessed, but the investigation had revealed something knotted beneath the original story, that systems designed for comfort can be bent toward concealment if no one is tasked with listening. And so he worked with legislators and safety boards and hotel chains to build the Natalie Act, a set of reforms that felt boring on paper and therefore effective in life. Independent redundancies for security feeds outside the main breaker path, audit trails for master key issuance that cannot be overwritten by pen, mandatory tamper-evident seals on duct access panels, routine acoustic baselining for large evaporative systems, a statewide registry for maintenance contractors that binds training materials to public standards instead of handed-down lore, and a quiet grant fund to help small motels retrofit without closing their doors, because resilience is cheaper than memory and better than monuments. On the anniversary of the arrest, the Sunrise Lodge stood empty behind a chain-link scrim, its windows blinded with sun-silvered film, and Ellen Brooks walked the perimeter with Ortega, a bouquet of grocery flowers in one hand, and asked the question that no court can decide, whether knowing helps. And he told her the only honest thing he had, that knowing is not the same as repairing, but it is where repairs begin. And they stood listening to a wind that carried no mechanical undertone because the building's power was cut and the ducts were still. And for the first time in years, he understood the absence of sound as an answer instead of a threat. That sometimes the air does not need to speak to be believed. And as the sun lowered into a sheet of molten color over the Gila, he thought of how the case had begun with an impossibility in Michigan and delivered him here through heat and habit, through rooms scrubbed too clean and vents tuned to lie, and how the thing worth keeping was not the story of men who hid inside noise, but of the ones who learned to hear through it. A manager who noticed a phone humming on a charger, a housekeeper who reached into a vent for a filter and pulled free a keycard, a mother who returned each year to place flowers against a fence until the cycle finally broke. And when he drove away, the building did not hum behind him because the system was quiet, the air unworked, and in the rear view the desert looked like an ocean cooled at last by night.